very conscious, Excellencies and distinguished delegates, that I am the only thing between you and a break, so I shall try to be as swift as possible. I am pleased to say that my presentation follows on very well from Mr. McCarthy's excellent one just now, where he gave us an overview of the various international initiatives with regards to AI. I am going to take a deeper look at some of the national initiatives, in particular, moving from the ethical regulation and the non-binding guidance, which we have seen a lot of, into pieces of binding legislation. I think this is very important because it is quite easy, to be honest, to say things like, AI should be used for good. AI should not be used for bad. These words are easy to say, they are not so easy to put into practice. And the countries that will do well with regards to AI are the ones which can put these broad principles into practice in an effective way. So I'm going to look at a few different topics, some of the leading countries. I won't tell you about what Dubai and what the UAE are doing, as many of you will be experts in that, but I will tell you about some of the other leading countries in this, and then finally look briefly at AI used in GovTech, the technology of government. So you've seen this slide already in Mr. McCarthy's presentation. I would draw attention to the fact that the UAE, you can see in October 2017, was one of the first adopters of an AI strategy, and that is important. It shows early leadership in this field, but it is important to maintain the momentum with this, and conferences like today's one and the initiatives that you are currently undertaking are extremely important and useful in that regard. So there are numerous benefits of having a national AI regulatory strategy. It is sometimes thought that regulation, on the one hand, is opposed to innovation. That if you have too much regulation, then entrepreneurs, the economy, will not do so well because they are constrained. There is an idea of having a laissez-faire, as they say in France, a light touch approach to regulation. Actually, the situation is that if you regulate well, if you regulate particularly a new technology in the correct way, that can assist innovation. It can create a stable environment which encourages people to establish themselves there. We've heard a bit today about how the UK has the Automated and Electric Vehicles Act on self-driving cars. They did this in 2018. It was one of the only pieces of legislation in 2018 which was not related to Brexit. Now, this is perhaps a reflection on the difficulties of the UK, but it emphasizes how important regulating AI was for the UK government. The reason why they wanted to do this so quickly was to beat Germany, to become the leading country for self-driving cars in the EU. And so by creating this legislation, they wanted to create certainty to encourage companies to establish their research and development programs in the UK. So that's an example of how if you regulate well, you can draw in the companies to establish themselves in your jurisdiction. Singapore, in many ways similar to the UAE and to Dubai, is a regional hub, and they have a national AI strategy which involves not just education of the population, but also creating regulations in a way that enables businesses to have certainty, but not to be overly constrained. In particular, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, its financial regulator, has a series of principles which they created last year in order to manage the use of AI in the financial sector. More recently, the Personal Data Commission has been looking at that, and that is one of the things that I've been helping the Singapore government to design. one of the main things that Singapore are doing is to have a model governance framework for AI. This is not yet binding, but it may become so in the future. It is similar in some ways to what the GDPR does, but for me, it is much better, because as we were hearing from Professor Donati, the GDPR, much of the language there was designed way before artificial intelligence technologies were developed. Some of the language comes from 1995, the previous piece of legislation. Some of the language comes from even before that, in the 1970s, when computers were new, let alone artificial intelligence. And so what Singapore has done successfully is to create guidance which is up to date, which understands, for example, that artificial intelligence may be a black box, and that sometimes you cannot fully explain it. Turning to the EU, which I've mentioned already, we've heard that the EU has the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which sets some binding requirements for AI. This is good on the one hand. There is law which people can look at. It's not just vague principles. But the problem is that this law, even though it is enforced now, is very difficult to integrate with the AI technology that's being used. The EU also, as we've heard, has guidelines on trustworthy AI. Right now, these are non-binding, but the new president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, who will take office within 10 days from now, at the end of this month, she has said in her first 100 days she is going to bring forth binding legislation on the ethical use of AI. So we are shortly to see some more regulations from the EU in this regard. And it will be very interesting to see whether they stick with the approach of the GDPR or whether they update it. Looking now at China, it's sometimes thought that China is only interested in economic growth, that it only wants power, that it doesn't like rules. Particularly in the West, this is how many countries in Europe, the US, thinks of China. This, I must tell you, is wrong. China does like rules. China does like international rules. But China wants to be the one writing those rules. China is very keen to have the power that comes from creating an international system. It doesn't mind that it may be bound by this system, but it wants to be the country which is dominating that system. And China has taken an early lead in creating the regulations for artificial intelligence. And there are some national initiatives which are up on the screen that talk about this. So as early as 2017, China said not just that it wants to be the world-leading power in creating AI technology, but also the world-leading regulator of AI technology. And there is a Chinese phrase, international discourse power. That is the Chinese characters up on the screen. This phrase says that if you are the one writing the rules, you have the power. And so that is a maxim that they exist by. Turning next to the United States, under President Obama, we saw some AI initiatives. However, in the early years of President Trump, the US ignored artificial intelligence. It was not important at all to it. And during these 2 years, now 3 years that Trump has been in power, we have seen China overtaking the US in becoming the world leader in driving forward AI regulation. The US has very recently woken up to this problem and realized that China is now taking the lead. So in February of 2019, we saw the US pass a White House executive order saying that it's going to become increasingly involved in creating AI regulation. So what we may now start to see is the US system of regulation and the Chinese system of regulation competing with each other to have the most powerful, the most adopted system across the world. Turning next to the UK, as I've already mentioned and we've heard a lot about, we have the Automated and Electric Vehicles Act. Finally, there is AI in the technology of government. That is to say, AI being used not just in the judiciary, but in other areas. We've already heard a lot from the learned experts about AI in law enforcement and AI in the justice system. It's also important to bear in mind that AI can be used in other governmental choices. For example, the distribution of funds, the question of where best to build a hospital, the question of who should receive benefits payments. Traditionally, these are decisions taken by humans, but we can see that AI could be used in order to automate these decisions, to make them more efficiently, perhaps to make them with less bias. It was very interesting to hear from Professor Donati about how AI could be used to reduce the bias and how, in fact, when judges make decisions, sometimes we don't understand the reasoning for judges' decisions. And I'll tell you a story about this before I finish. There was an important experiment done a few years ago where judges were taking decisions on whether prisoners should be granted parole, whether they should be allowed to be freed from prison after a certain amount of time. Researchers looked at the statistics of how lenient the judges were, and you know what they discovered? Before lunch, and I fear that I'm speaking before lunch, they were much more harsh to the prisoners. After lunch, they were much happier, and they let much more of the prisoners go free. So we can see that even small things like how comfortable you are, how hungry you are, affects judges. Now, I'm sure this would not affect anyone in this room, but we can see that in other systems we have these issues. And the judges themselves probably did not realize that this was how they were being influenced. So that is an example of how we have these human weaknesses that perhaps we can reduce with AI. That said, it is still important, as we've heard from many of the other learned speakers, and I will emphasize again, that there are checks and balances on how the AI is used. So, to conclude, when writing rules for artificial intelligence, the problems are clear, the tools are at our disposal. The question is not whether we can, but whether we will. Thank you very much.